Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be talking about the Transcontinental Railroad, when the United States stretched its railroad capacity into the West out to California. And Chris, I'm one of those people, I love trains. So this is one of those historical accounts that I really enjoy reading about and studying about and even teaching about.
Well, all aboard for this wonderful experience of learning about trains. And would you consider yourself to be like the locomotive, or do you think you're more like the caboose?
I'm a caboose.
You're a caboose.
Well, no doubt about it. I think when most people see me, they think caboose.
But you have to have both.
Yes.
I mean,
so what are you? Are you a caboose or locomotive?
No, I think I'm full steam ahead. I think I would be the locomotive, but you're always excited. And our listeners might be looking for the caboose after this podcast too, because that signifies it's over with.
Trains don't really have cabooses anymore. That has been phased out. So I don't know what that says about me, but
Well, they'll just add the sleeper car to this episode, I guess.
There we
Sleep
go.
right on through it. So
I have ridden in a sleeper car, and you don't sleep very well in a sleeper car. So, yeah.
Well, but you know what? Through this railroad experience, it was a difficult journey, and I think we just come to expect that there's railroad tracks and there's trains, and you've always been able to get from Wilmington to San Francisco. All you had to do was, get on a train, get in a car, get in a plane, and you just cross this beautiful country. But really, when we're talking about the 1860s and even earlier than that, you really didn't have that opportunity. And for me, you being a lover of trains, that the steam locomotive actually doesn't come about until 1830. And then the next thing you know is there is a mad rush to unite both sides of America for the purposes of helping society grow. But my gosh, even in this story we talk about today, there is so much history you should know, and we just didn't know it. And so I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Yeah, and this Transcontinental Railroad, I mean, if you look at a map of the railroads of the United States prior to the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, east of the Mississippi, there were railroads, that had sprung up over the years, and, just railroads all over the place. But once you hit west of the Mississippi, you just didn't have a lot. So it would sometimes take people months to travel, let's say, from the Mississippi River to California, with the gold rush or whatever. It could take people months to make that trip. Some people, instead of making that trip, would actually go south in a boat down toward the southern rim of South America and come all the way back up, which of course that would take a long time as well. So before the construction and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, going from North Carolina to California was a big deal. I mean, it was going to take you several months to get there. Once the Transcontinental Railroad is completed, it's going to only be a matter of under a week. We're talking a matter of days.
Yeah. And there's several things going through that just to kind of help our listeners gain some additional detail to this. You're right. You could go by sea around the Cape of Good, what was it? The Cape of Cape Horn, I think is what it was. Yeah. You could go around Cape Horn, but that would take you 6 months. Mm-hmm. So imagine if you are someone who's trying to trade, or you're producing, maybe you're trying to sell tobacco from the fields of Virginia, and you're trying to get it over to San Francisco. Well, your tobacco could be rotten by the time you actually took that ship and went around, Cape Horn, a 6-month journey. But then what they decided to do is they said, okay, well, we don't have to go around the, Cape Horn. We'll go through this new invention called the Panama Canal. We'll take the Panama, go through the Panama Canal, but then that's ravaged by yellow fever and typhoid and all kinds of diseases. So you don't have the opportunity to use that as well. And, I remember when individuals were before the railroads trying to get from point A to point B, North Carolina to California, it would cost like $1,000.
Mhm.
That period of money. So $1,000 then, I mean, you can just imagine how expensive that must have been for those individuals. So I think that because of trade, and just because of sectionalism and the division of America, there's a need for the bringing together, if you will, the country. But it's not going to be as easy, nor is it going to be as clean of an effort as we once thought, because the geography of America, just in general, is going to play some into this. I mean, for the most part, everything, I think you were talking about the Missouri River, everything east of there is like 9,000 miles of track. Well, sure, but that environment's a little different from the Sierra, mountains and all of those aspects on the western side.
Yeah, and one of the gentlemen we're going to talk about, you talk about the Isthmus of Panama. One of the guys that we're going to talk about today, Theodore Judah, one of the people who's going to be influential in the early work of sort of dreaming up this transcontinental railroad. He's going to die of yellow fever, contracted down there. And of course, yellow fever is spread by mosquitoes, if our listeners didn't know that. So that's going to be something that is going to affect a lot of people. And Chris, you also mentioned the sectionalism. And one of the things that really slows down the Transcontinental Railroad is the sectionalism and the Civil War, because the Transcontinental Railroad is first presented by a guy called Asa Whitney in 1845. And of course, it really doesn't go anywhere because the nation is becoming more and more divided over slavery and states' rights and all of that kind of stuff. So people just really aren't in the mood to hear about this. So it's not really until 1861. Of course, the Civil War is sort of ramping up at this particular point in time. But Abraham Lincoln, it passes through Congress, and Abraham Lincoln signs it in 1862 in the middle of the Civil War. But of course, it's not going to be until really after the war that things really start picking up with the Transcontinental Railroad and the construction of it.
Well, and you want it to be an easy thing. I mean, everybody's in agreement. There needs to be connection point from East Coast to West Coast, but there's always that starting point. Well, how do you do it? And there's individuals, I think you mentioned Theodore Judah, who basically said, okay, I'm going to be the one that tries to make this happen. And he gets some people together, some very influential as well as wealthy people from the West Coast. But he's got to sell it to Washington. I mean, as you just mentioned, it's already failed basically since 1845. So he's got to do a really good job persuading Congress that, hey, this is a good thing, this is needed. But then he's also got to go to the president of the United States, who the last thing he's really interested in is connecting one side of the country with the other, because he's trying to actually keep the southern states from leaving the Union, and he's trying to prevent a civil war from happening. So sometimes you might just say, well, it's just not the right time, maybe later. But in this situation, Judah's not going to take no for an answer. He's going to be very deliberate in trying to persuade Lincoln that this is the time for many reasons. One being, hey, you got a civil war. If you really want to trade your goods and send your goods back and forth, this will work. So, he's very dogged in determining how to do it.
Yeah, and Lincoln, like we mentioned earlier, does sign, despite everything Lincoln's got going on, but that you just mentioned, he does sign this Pacific Railroad Act. And it's very interesting to me because I try to keep in my head, okay, which company is which? Because there are two companies that the way this legislation is set up, it's almost like a competition, the Great Railroad Race. Mm-hmm. So there's these two companies. There's the Central Pacific Railroad Company, and it's going to start in Sacramento, California, and it's going to move east. And of course, like you mentioned earlier, it's going to have to deal with the Sierra Nevada mountains. It's going to have a harder time Then the other company, which is the Union Pacific Railroad, which is going to start really on the Iowa-Nebraska border, and they're going to be traveling west, and the two sides will eventually meet. But it's basically going to be like this race between the two sides. And what they're going to do is that each company, the Central Pacific Railroad Company and the Union Pacific Railroad Company, would get about 6,400 acres of land and $48,000 in government bonds for every mile of track they built. So basically, the company that's going to build the most track, the company that's going to cover the most land, they're going to be the company that not only has the ability to say, hey, look what we did, but they're also going to be the company that's going to come out financially ahead of the other company. And it's interesting, Chris, there wasn't any, in this legislation, there wasn't anything that said, okay, Pacific Railroad, Union Pacific, you cover this amount of land. Central Pacific, you cover this amount of land. No, it was on your mark, get set, go. And whoever covered the most land would get the most money and land out of it.
Yeah, and you also have to understand that during this time, we have these titans of industry that's also coming about also, and competition fueled American interest. I mean, it was all about competition. Not only do you have competition in the form of a war during this period, but you have competition in the form of who can create your factories, who can create, this good that will better American society. And so there is competition. And it's, as you also mentioned, this is not going to be a railroad that starts at point A on the Sacramento side and starts at point B on the Missouri River side, and they just draw a straight line and connect it. This is going to be one of those winding railroads that, once again, people were very in tune with, because you have people in Texas that are saying, hey, I want the railroad to come down my way because I have cattle, I have goods. And if you're going to make me take my cattle and go all the way up to Iowa and Nebraska and catch the train, I'm going to lose interest. I'm going to lose money. It's not going to be beneficial. So that's that sectionalism also. You got the people in the South wanting the railroad. You got the people in the West wanting it in a certain place. So you've got to try to find a good place for it to begin. And I think what happens is everybody's ambitious. They're full of competition. They're ready to do this. And so they say, all right, we're going to start. But remember, it's all about that money and it's about that land, because they're smart to know that wherever you have a railroad track, you're going to have a station. And where you have the station, you're going to have hotel. You're going to have a saloon. You're going to have a village, a city kind of a deal. So the more miles of track one group lays, not only do they get more money, but they're also setting themselves up for the expansion of America, where their friends can then invest in those particular areas, and that area will grow, be successful, bringing more money into it also. And we see that later on. I think it was the Union Pacific Railroad, because it's easy, we get them confused. Union Pacific, which was the one on the Missouri side, they actually do some illegal means to kind of fund the whole train operation.
Yeah, both sides sort of do some shady things. I was going to talk about the Central Pacific Railroad, which of course is the one that starts in Sacramento. And, these guys, and we're going to talk in a minute about the Big Four, but these guys, they borrow heavily. A lot of money they're borrowing to fund this project. They use, every once in a while, loophole, they find the legal loopholes they can use to take advantage of. And of course, both of these companies are in a race, literally, as we said. They're very ambitious people. They've got a lot on the line. Both of these companies will cut corners, even on bridges that they plan to go back and fix later. They'll do sort of shoddy work just to get over it, and then they'll come back later to fix it. But you mentioned the Union Pacific Railroad, a guy called Dr. Thomas Durant. He gained control of the Union Pacific Railroad Company, and he basically had total control of the company, and he's going to set up a company which basically guarantees him and all of his investors risk-free profits, basically, from the construction of the railroad. So both sides, both the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, both of these railroads and the people behind these railroads are in it to make money, to make a quick buck, and to get this done as quickly as possible.
Also, both companies had significant land issues that they had to deal with. You've got the Central Pacific, which is basically, I don't know, Ray, I kind of imagine it's like you and me getting on the basketball court and starting a game.
That would be ugly. Go ahead.
Well, that's what I was going to say. So we'd start a game of horse. And as you say, it's going to be so ugly. So I'd probably have to give you an advantage. I'd probably have to say, okay, I'll start with HOR and you have 0 and we'll start. And that's kind of what you're expecting in this railroad thing, right? Because it's really not fair to, if you think about it, it's not fair to the Central Pacific because they're starting in the mountains.
Yeah.
And
they've got clear paths. I mean, they use some natural paths and stuff, but in other places they have to use explosives to clear their way through.
So you have that issue, which is going to just slow you down, and time is money. And so, you're working hard to try to get that. But the Missouri people, even though they're coming across the Great Plains, one of the issues they're going to have to deal with are the Native Americans.
Yes.
Because who's the last people that want the train to come through the area are the Native Americans, because they've already been pushed out from the East Coast. They've been pushed out through the Trail of Tears. They've made their way to this area thinking that finally we're not happy. This isn't where we want it to be, but we're here and we can establish ourselves. Next thing you know, they look up and here comes this, I forget, what did they call it? They called it like the iron, what was it?
Iron horse, yeah.
The iron horse. And they see this iron horse barreling its way towards them. And I can only imagine that once again, there's this great fear, because if they start going that way, then they're going to look the other way and see the other iron horse coming. So both of these companies are facing tremendous difficulties, although I would have to say that it's basically the Central Pacific that's going to have it harder because they're coming from California than the Union Pacific. But what helps is the type of people that's actually working on the railroads. That makes a big difference also.
Yeah, both sides bring in a variety of different people. In 1865, the Central Pacific, which is the one coming from Sacramento, hires a lot of Chinese laborers. And this is a very controversial move. I think they hired almost around 45 to 55,000 of these Chinese immigrants to work on the railroad. And they work hard. I mean, they earn their keep. They earn their money on these railroads. They work in very dangerous conditions, very unsafe conditions, and they're dealing with a lot of challenges. But they work very hard to push through. But it is interesting. It is very controversial at the time because there's a lot of racism against Asians throughout America at this time. So the idea that this company is hiring these Chinese immigrants is not a very popular idea.
For the simple reason, and I think that it is so important to keep going back to with our listeners as to what's going on during this time. Not only are we having experienced the end of the Civil War, but we also have this nativism that is very prevalent in America, which is against any immigrant that's coming into America, but especially those who are coming in from Asia, specifically in this case, the Chinese laborers. And the big reason for that is it's very simple. It even goes back to early American history. Those that came onto the shores were willing to work hard and demonstrated hard work, and also were willing to undergo brutal working conditions. They didn't get paid as much, but they still gave everything that they had. And we just have to be honest. That infuriated those who were already here. Yeah. They didn't like how hard the Chinese laborers were working. It didn't go well with who they were. And so, you have them. And then on the other side, when you're looking at the Union Pacific, they've got a bunch of rough and ready Germans and Irishmen. And sure, they don't mind working, but what's more important to them than working is drinking. And so they're out there, they work, but then they drink and they gamble. And so it's just, I remember one story of these Irish and Germans, and they didn't get along. They were having their own issues, and they're working on the railroad. And so they would work and they'd be drinking while they were working, and then they would stop. And then they slept in this, like the sleeper car kind of things, right? I mean, they were just like little shacks where they were sleeping. But when it got dark, all you did was lit a candle and you started playing cards and you started gambling. And then they got mad because they were drunk. They lost money. They didn't like the working conditions. And so fights broke out.
Yep.
So I don't know how this railroad actually got put together when you've got one group of people blasting holes into mountains using gunpowder and standing on these small, thin rails. And I think they also used an early form of nitroglycerin to actually get the holes in the. And then on the other side, you got a bunch of drunks trying to lay railroad. No wonder the railroad's not straight. It's all over the place. Look at the map. Now you know why.
I will tell you, Chris, one thing that I'm always amazed about, and I think I'm amazed by it because I'm so bad at directions. I don't know what I did before GPS, before my smartphone and my GPS in the car, but I don't know how they knew, okay, well, we need to go here and then turn north at this particular point. If I was in charge of it, I'd have been building the railroad in the wrong direction. So it's always amazing to me that these people knew, and I know, there were ways that they mapped this stuff out. But it always amazes me that they were able to do these things with such precision, despite all the challenges that they had.
And the two companies weren't talking to each other.
No.
Because it was a competition. And add to that, if anybody has ever lifted a railroad tie.
Oh my gosh, yes.
One of the heaviest pieces of wood you could ever imagine in your life. So you're seeing them, not just laying it, but carrying these railroad ties, putting them in the ground, and then, Ray, those spikes.
Mm-hmm.
And just hammering them into bedrock, it is fascinating to me, once again, that this thing, and I think that we come to take it for granted, and we do not appreciate the sacrifice that was made by the workers. I'm not really going to say the sacrifices made necessarily by Stanford and his group, and what was the other guy? Grenville Dodge, not really them, because they're just reaping money off this. Yeah. But for those hard workers, the amount of backbreaking work that they had to do, it astounds me. And I think, America really needs to show a great appreciation for the hard work that they did, and the fact that they were making progress, and that by 1869, they're pretty much almost in sight of one another.
Yeah, you talk about the progress. 1867, Union Pacific is already in Wyoming. The Central Pacific is through the mountains, or they're coming out the other side. Of course, both companies are racing to get as much land covered as they can for the rewards. But it is interesting that in 1869, President Ulysses S. Grant basically looks at both companies and says, I'm not giving you another dime until you figure out where you're going to meet. You need to come up with a place to end this, basically. So they decide to meet at a place north of the Great Salt Lake, about 690 miles from Sacramento and about 1,080 miles from Omaha. And they meet there on May 10, 1869, And there's this picture, this famous picture. If anybody still has an old history book or whatever, you've got this picture of these two groups. That the locomotives are nose to nose, and you've got the people, sort of climbing on both locomotives as these two trains meet. And then, Chris, they have something that I just sort of laugh when I read about it: the golden spike ceremony. So they have this golden spike made of 17.6 karat gold, and they are supposed to, these big important people are supposed to nail this spike into the railroad there. And one of the big four tries to do it. He is not able to do it. Then one of the Union Pacific guys swings and misses, and I read that he was apparently drunk when he did this, so of course he missed. And it ended up being just regular railroad workers who managed to put this golden spike into the ground around noon on May 10, 1869. And I just find that to be hilarious, because you got these real important, wealthy bigwigs who have no clue what they're out there doing, and they're trying to have the important moment of nailing this spike into the ground, which of course the spike is pulled up and replaced with a real spike, but they're still going to have this really important moment where they're going to nail this spike into the ground, and none of them can do it. And they've got to go to the workers who they depended on the whole time anyway to actually get the quote golden spike into the ground.
Well, nothing's changed. I mean, publicity moments. I mean, when you're cutting the ribbon, who's there? Is it the workers? No, it's going to be, city officials, town officials, owners of the place, and you miss the hardworking people that do it. And as I mentioned earlier, yeah, I mean, he didn't just, have a I mean, he missed. But first of all, try to imagine that guy picking up the maul or whatever it was that he was using. I just have that image of him saying, camera's ready, everybody ready. And he misses. And then the other guy, yeah. And by the way, the other guy, he was with the Irish and the Germans. And so, of course, he was drunk. He had been partying because they had finally met at Promontory Summit. And he was like, hey, we've done this. This is great. And, next thing you know, he misses. And I just have to imagine that the Chinese laborers and the Germans and the Irish must have just been sitting there having a ball watching these two very rich, very powerful people try to nail one spike, and couldn't do it.
I'm sure they got ragged pretty hard.
Yeah. And, I mean, you can just imagine, but it is interesting that if anybody has the opportunity to head on over to the other side of America, to Stanford University, they could go to Stanford University and they can actually still see the famous golden spike. It is in the Museum of Leland Stanford, who was one of the big four who helped make the railroad happen. And, what did it do, Ray? It cut it from going from months to days. And instead of it being $1,000, I think it became like $150. So all aboard for the express train that really got this country moving.
Yeah. And, you talk about, it was steam, the invention of steam pushed this forward. You think about all the way, something, I don't want to say simple, but something like steam. You think of the steamboats and what they were able to do in the Mississippi River. You think of trains operated by steam, how steam was able to change the country, and then the railroads and westward expansion, how it changed the country. And of course, the advent of the Transcontinental Railroad is going to speed that up.
Isn't it interesting that even in the midst of a train wreck, you can still have success?
Yeah.
Because this whole thing was a train wreck.
Yeah.
I mean, they tried to cheat. They did not take care of their employees. They didn't know where they were going, as you mentioned. I mean, all of these things, it is a train wreck. But look at how we are today, and look how thankful we are. And you ever ridden on a train?
I have ridden on an Amtrak in a sleeper car, mind you.
Yeah, you said you didn't sleep much when you said that earlier.
I did not sleep much because the first night I was on there, every time the train would turn a corner, I thought I was going to fall off the bed. And then I kept waking up throughout the night because when a train, have you ever ridden on one?
So, yeah, I've ridden on one, but it was at like the state fair, and it just went around in a circle. You had to pay just
when,
a ticket.
when they would cross, this train's going 70, 80 miles an hour, and it would cross where the tracks cross. It would go over that. I mean, it felt at times it would feel like the train was getting ready to derail. I mean, it was not a smooth trip. But Chris, I'll tell you, I'd do it again because I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. I'd much prefer that than being in a car for 12 hours. I'd much prefer being in a train for 12 hours, even if it's not necessarily the smoothest ride or most sophisticated ride. There's something nice about riding the rails.
Well, and I just appreciate you being the conductor of this podcast and helping take us through the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and how it opened up the American West. And eventually, it's created an opportunity for us to go and explore. So if anybody has the opportunity to get on board and go take a train trip, do it.
And Chris, the thing about trains like Amtrak is if you got to get somewhere, okay, I need to be at such and such a place by 5 p.m. on Monday, maybe trains aren't the best way to go because they can be delayed for all sorts of reasons. When you take a train trip, the trip on the train is just as important as the destination.
Yeah,
it's about the experience of the trip. One more thing I wanted to throw in there. We talked about the competition between the two companies. The Union Pacific Railroad, the one coming traveling west, covered more territory than the Central Pacific Railroad. But of course, the Central Pacific Railroad had a harder time. So
that was very philosophical what you just said, that it's not about the destination.
There you go. It's not. I mean, if you when I rode on Amtrak both times, it was late, an hour or more late each time. But you don't mind it because it's part of the trip.
It's kind of like this podcast.
Yep.
You want to get to the destination, but you enjoy every stop you make on the experience of a lifetime through history you didn't know but should. So thank you for leading us on a wonderful experience this day.
Absolutely. And Chris, I noticed the other day we're coming up on our 60th episode. We have a whole back catalog now of episodes that our listeners can go back and listen to us on. Of course, you can find us on Sounder FM, Spotify, Google Podcast. We have a Facebook page. We're on Twitter. You can find us all over the place. We encourage you to go back into that back catalog. Every once in a while on Facebook, when a event is sort of like on this day and that we've covered it in one of our back catalog podcasts, I always try to go back and repost that particular episode. So I encourage you to like us on Facebook, find us on Twitter, and share this podcast with your friends and family. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can always email us at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know, @gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.